get on the ground right now!
What's up, you guys? Welcome back to Southern Draw Law. My name is James White, criminal defense attorney, former prosecutor, former police officer. Well, a Michigan State police trooper attached to a federal fugitive task force has quietly murdered a 25-year-old black man named Samuel Sterling, as Mr. Sterling was attempting to flee from capture for felony warrants back in April of this year. I really don't know how I missed this story, to be honest with you, but somehow I'm just now hearing about it. Now, I've attached the video from the ABC affiliate 13 on your side. I do want to warn you, this is devastating to watch, but it's important that every human eye see this video. Let's watch.
You're getting our first look at body and dash camera video of the moment a man was hit by an unmarked state police vehicle. Samuel Sterling later died from his injuries in a hospital. Michigan State Police says Sterling was wanted on outstanding felonies and ran from police. 13 Your Side's Jeremiah Brown watched that video, and we do want to warn you that it may be difficult for some viewers to watch.
Sterling, get on the ground right now!
It was April 17th when state police say they spotted Samuel Sterling putting air in his tires near 52nd and Eastern Avenue in Kentwood. Police say Sterling was wanted on outstanding felony warrants and ran when police tried to make contact with him. Body cam footage from a Wyoming police officer shows Sterling running into a Burger King parking lot off Eastern Avenue as he is then seen struck by an unmarked MSP cruiser. Video from a responding state trooper shows the unmarked vehicle driving into Samuel Sterling. As officers get closer, we see Sterling pinned against the wall of the Burger King. He is then told to put his hands behind his back and roll over, all while he is moaning.
Behind your back. Hands behind your back. Roll over. Get on your back. Hands behind your back. Hold on, take it easy.
The Wyoming officer is heard calling for medical help moments after Sterling is struck.
We need medical started for a suspect. Can we have a med one right now, please?
Meanwhile, other officers are seen putting a knee on Sterling's back and handcuffing him.
Relax.
While moaning in pain, Sterling is heard saying he doesn't have a gun and asking why he was hit.
Why you me like this?
Officers tell him not to move and focus on his breathing, and that help is on the way.
So don't move, man. Got a medical start here for us.
A little more than 4 minutes after Sterling was hit, the fire department arrives.
Pin it in the wall.
Sterling asking for medics to help him.
We didn't even know this was a police chase, right? We just got a car accident.
Sterling passed away later that day in the hospital.
Now, Jeremiah, has the video from the state police officer that hit Sterling, has that been released?
Well, Lena, MSP says that the officer did not have a body camera due to being on a federal task force, and his vehicle did not have a camera as well. The officer that struck Sterling remains on an unpaid suspension pending the case's review from the state's attorney general.
All right, thank you, Jeremiah.
Now, in addition to the video we just watched, the various in-car and body cam videos of the incident were released by the MSP as their veiled offering of transparency, even though they investigated the incident themselves without inviting an outside agency to conduct the investigation, which we all know how that goes. I've linked the MSP releases, but they basically show the same thing we've just shown you, and then about 15 minutes of Sterling rolling around on the ground, moaning, and essentially dying on the sidewalk while the cops stood around and gave him further directives and treated him like trash. So if you want to watch that, the link is in the description. But the facts of the case are pretty straightforward and covered in the video we've already watched. So one of the things that you may not know if you've never been around law enforcement is that the federal agencies like the ATF and the U.S. Marshal Service and the DEA often assemble fugitive or violent crime task forces, and then they deputize local law enforcement and lean on them for their connection to the local community so they can get reliable information through informants and that kind of stuff in order to effectively enforce the law in local communities on a federal level. So a standard task force might involve multiple counties and include sworn officers from every agency within the counties, from municipal, county, state, and federal level, as is the case here. The officers assigned to these task forces do most of their police work without the same sort of direct supervision they'd have on a normal patrol shift. As a result, they take on sort of a cowboy approach, very cavalier in the way that they do things, and they start to kind of adopt a whatever it takes mentality, and they do their operations without the same sort of oversight and scrutiny ordinarily accompanying a local law enforcement unit. This is as evident in this case as any case that you'll ever see. So you might ask the question, as I did, What on earth would compel this trooper to plow his cruiser into this guy as he's running away, if not just for an absolute lack of respect or concern for human life? Well, that's actually an easier question to answer than any other or any legal analysis that we might undertake here shortly. The answer, though, reflects the very worst of the us versus them mentality. In the view of these guys, there are good guys and then there are bad guys. And then there's a third classification of expendable people who are collateral damage if they get in the way of the good guys getting the bad guys. That's it. It doesn't require a nuanced approach to understand this. The officers assigned to these teams get up every day and they put 1 foot at a time into an unreasonably tight pair of blue jeans. They pull on an extra medium t-shirt, slide their plate carrier over their way too long hair, strap on their tactical drop thigh holster, find a mirror on the wall and tell themselves that they're operators and that no matter what happens today, they're coming home. Whoever has to die in order for that to happen is an acceptable community loss in the interest of that outcome. The end always justifies the means. As pathetic and scary as it sounds, they behave like the extreme examples of police officers in undercover units as portrayed in Hollywood films and TV shows, and for the most part, they escape any sort of substantial oversight in the process due to the fact that they're tied to the federal government. More on that later. Now, feelings about law enforcement aside, the legal question at play here is what level of force is permissible to apprehend a fleeing suspect? Set aside for a second the Constitution's mandate that Samuel Sterling is considered innocent of the charges underlying the outstanding warrant and assume just for the sake of the analysis that he is in fact guilty, a felon, fleeing from law enforcement's attempt to apprehend him. What can they do? We need to look no further than Tennessee, which is also in the 6th Federal Circuit, just like the state of Michigan, for the answer. In 1985, the Supreme Court of the United States decided the landmark case Tennessee versus Garner. And in that case, the court held that an officer may not shoot dead a fleeing suspect in the absence of probable cause to believe the person poses a significant threat of death or serious injury to the officers or others. Now, the name Garner in that case referred to the father of Edward Garner, a 15-year-old kid who fled from a Memphis police officer investigating a prowler complaint. As young Garner jumped a fence, the officer fired a shot to the back of his head. The father of Mr. Garner brought an excessive force case, and the court levied its opinion thereafter. Now, at the time, the state of Tennessee authorized by statute officers within the state to use all necessary means to effect the arrest of a person after the police had given notice to the person that they were under arrest. But in finding the Tennessee statute unconstitutional, the Supreme Court opined that the use of deadly force frustrates the interest of the individual and of society in the judicial determination of guilt and punishment. Because again, how do we preserve the fundamental presumption of innocence if the person accused gets a death sentence before they ever see the inside of a courtroom? Well, you can't, and the court recognized that. The court further went on to say that the use of deadly force to prevent the escape of all felony suspects, regardless of the circumstance, is constitutionally unreasonable. It's not better that all felony suspects die than it is that they escape. And the opinion further held that a police officer may not seize an unarmed, non-dangerous suspect by shooting him dead. This case has been cited by thousands of deadly and excessive force cases since 1985, and the rule has basically been unchanged since then. So now that we know what it takes to justify deadly force, we need to determine whether the force used against Sterling in this case was in fact deadly force. Now you might say it looks like the officer is simply trying to close off Sterling's path of escape and didn't intend to hit him with the cruiser. Well, for one, if that's your position, I'd ask you to watch the video again and again and again and submit to you until you figure out what your eyes are actually seeing, that you are actually being betrayed by your mind if that's what you see. And two, even if you believe that, it doesn't matter. As you may or may not know, police officers often carry steel collapsible batons, referred to as ASP batons or monadnock batons, or sometimes they carry wooden batons called PR-24s. The training provided for any baton that a police officer carries makes it understood that they are to be used on legs, arms, and areas of the body not normally associated with a high risk of death. The strikes that are to be delivered by these batons are done in a diagonal direction in a certain way, and if, as a police officer, the tool that you are intending to use, and that tool is capable of causing death, and it's then used on parts of the body that are associated normally with a high risk of death, even accidentally, it can be considered deadly force. So if you accidentally strike somebody in the head because you aimed for their arm and they ducked, then you have essentially exacted deadly force on that person, and you need to be justified under the rule that we just mentioned about how you can go about using deadly force and in what circumstances you can do that legally. So in light of that, you might wonder, well, how does that have anything to do with the use of a vehicle, especially if you believe that the officer's intent here was to simply box Sterling in to prevent his escape and the officer lost control accidentally? Well, just think about what you know. How many times have you watched a person being shot by the police on video while they're behind the wheel of a vehicle, and the officer has intentionally positioned him or herself in the vehicle's path while the suspect is attempting to escape? It's fairly obvious in the video that the person intends only to escape, and the officer has placed themselves in danger, and nevertheless, time and time again, those shootings are deemed justified because the vehicle is being used as a deadly weapon. The analysis here is no different. Routinely, people were charged with reckless endangerment, vehicular homicide, and assault with a deadly weapon for the manner in which they operate their vehicle, whether it's intentional, whether it's reckless, or whether it's negligent. So it's a two-way street. For better or worse, law enforcement is indisputably anchored to the viability of the theory that a vehicle being used in a particular manner, or a manner to hit or threaten to hit a person, is considered a deadly weapon. And if anyone should know that, it should be a law enforcement officer. Now, to disprove the notion that all the trooper was trying to do was cut off Sterling's escape path, I've actually slowed down the portion of the Wyoming officer's body cam to illustrate something of significance here. It appears to me that the officer is approaching Sterling in the vehicle, and he probably realizes he's going too fast, and there's a curb there attached to that lane there by the drive-through. He checks the brakes. So in the frame, when you slow it down very slow, you can see no brake lights as they approach, then a split second of brake lights, and then no brake lights again. What I see in that is that the officer intended to try and use the vehicle to pin Sterling against the wall, but didn't want to really crash into the building at full speed. However, the officer was unable to control the vehicle's speed to accomplish that without causing mortal injuries to Sterling. So what you have here is a failed attempt by the trooper to sort of slow walk the vehicle up against him and sort of cram him into the building, and you actually have just what essentially becomes a punch of the vehicle smashing Sterling into the building and sort of holding him there while crushing his internal organs. Now, if you're of the opinion that the trooper was only intending to close off a pathway to escape, I'll advise you to look at the layout of the building. You see the sidewalk, right? And you see that corner of the building right there by what would be ostensibly the drive-through window. Just ahead of the point where the vehicle makes contact with Sterling, you see that portion of the building has a sharp corner that's wider than the width of the police cruiser would be. So if that was the officer's intent, the officer certainly could have positioned his vehicle and attacked that at the angle of making contact from the front of his vehicle to the corner of that building, and potentially created like a closed off alley for Sterling to be stuck in while the Wyoming officer that was closing on foot made the arrest. This trooper intentionally and obviously, in my opinion, made the decision to make contact with Sterling's body with their vehicle. Nothing indicates that the officer intended to simply block Sterling's path. An entirely different angle and plenty of space was available for that, and that might have been a reasonable thing to do under the circumstances. Had that choice been made, Samuel Sterling would likely be enjoying his constitutionally guaranteed presumption of innocence instead of being dead. But that's not what happened. Now, you might find hope in the fact that Michigan has historically been willing to prosecute officers for homicide in cases of unreasonable deadly force. As we speak, former Grand Rapids, Michigan police officer Christopher Scher is awaiting trial for the murder of Patrick Lyoya after he shot Lyoya in the back of the head during an attempted arrest from a traffic stop in 2022. You might remember that video. Lyoya is stopped for a plate violation. The officer, Christopher Scher, is trying to get him to comply with the traffic stop, essentially. He ends up grabbing him, trying to place him under arrest. They struggle around. They end up in a neighbor's yard. Officer Scher ends up deploying his taser twice, and the taser's underneath Lyoya's body. Now, Lyoya's substantially larger than Scher, and Scher is on Lyoya's back, but he ends up basically running out of options, or feeling like he ran out of options, or whatever his justification was. He draws his service pistol and shoots Lyoya in the back of the head. Now, again, the taser, while it might be considered a deadly weapon, once it's fired 2 deployments of the darts, it doesn't have a 3rd deployment of the darts. Depending on the model of taser, you have a certain number, right? So in this particular case, Grand Rapids had 2 shots. So once that happens, the only way to disable a person with a taser is to do what's called a drive stun. And if you've ever been shot with the darts of a taser, like I have, you understand there's a substantial difference between a drive stun and being shot with the darts. A drive stun is where you just put the probes of the taser against somebody's skin. Well, As soon as you feel the shock of that, you can pull away and you can break the connection. So it's very difficult to actually disable somebody and like take an officer's gun if the only way that you can use the taser is through a drive stun. So it's really difficult to make the argument that Mr. Lioya laying on his belly down and the taser being underneath him was enough of a threat for Christopher Scher to justify shooting him in the back of the head, and that's why he's on trial for second-degree murder in Michigan. Because the state attorney correctly, I might add, decided that Scher's use of deadly force in that case was unreasonable given the threat posed by Lioya at the time. In this case, you have absolutely no known threat to the officer or anyone else. You just have a person daring to elude capture from the jump out boys, and that's it. Now, there are a couple of differences of note in the two cases that we're talking about. Number one, the city of Grand Rapids in the Lioya shooting asked for an outside agency, ironically, the Michigan State Police, to conduct the investigation. They didn't investigate themselves. So it'll be interesting to see whether the MSP holds their own agency to the same standards they hold the officers from outside agencies to in the course of this investigation. Now, it might be at least encouraging that the trooper is said to be on unpaid leave pending the outcome of the investigation. Of course, that may be the standard practice in Michigan, I'm not sure, but from the areas of the world where I've been associated with law enforcement, officers go on paid leave for standard internal investigations unless it appears on its face that they'll eventually be fired over the circumstances. So it may be an encouraging sign that he's not being paid, or it might be that that's the standard practice of the MSP, or they might be manipulating the public by saying he's on unpaid leave because he's not being paid by MSP. His salary is in fact being subsidized by the federal government for the task force he's attached to. Who knows? It's hard to glean anything of substance from that fact alone. The second major difference is that it can at least be argued during the killing of Sterling that it's more reckless than intentional, whereas the killing of Lioya cannot be argued as anything but intentional. Absent justification, it's straight up murder. It's obvious when you shoot someone in the back of the head that your intent is to kill them. But that probably doesn't matter under Michigan law, and here's why. In most areas of the country, there's a rule called the felony murder rule. It basically says that if you're committing a felony of any kind, and as a result of your actions, any person dies, you're guilty of felony murder. And in a lot of places, felony murder is the same as first-degree murder. This is even true where the police or a Good Samaritan kills a co-defendant in the process of like a bank robbery or something. Let's say you and your buddy are robbing a bank and the security guard or a Good Samaritan or a police officer shoots and kills your buddy. You then get charged with felony murder and held accountable for your buddy's death because you willingly entered into a plan to commit a felony and your buddy died as a result. Or maybe you're the getaway driver and you don't even go into the bank, but as you try to leave, you strike and kill a pedestrian that's trying to cross the street and you're trying to get away. You're a co-conspirator for the felony, someone died, and you're guilty of felony murder. Most commonly nowadays, this is being used to charge drug dealers when people overdose and die from the drugs sold to them. The idea there is you're committing a felony of trafficking drugs, someone died from a fentanyl overdose, you're responsible for their death. Whatever the theory, Michigan has abolished the felony murder rule as we would normally analyze it, and they basically charge everyone with either first or second degree murder, depending on whether they can prove premeditation. Now, the elements of second degree murder are a death caused by an act of the defendant, with malice, and without justification. So obviously in this case, we have a death caused by the officer, and according to Tennessee v. Garner, it's not justified under the circumstances that we're aware of, so the only element remaining to analyze is malice. And you might be unsure whether the trooper was actually malicious in his approach to this situation, but the way we'd normally frame malice or malicious intent in our minds is not how the courts define it. In a Michigan appeals case from 1993 called People v. Reeves, the court laid out the legal definition of malice as follows. Malice is the intent to kill, the intent to cause great bodily harm, or the intent to do an act in wanton and willful disregard of the likelihood that the natural tendency of such behavior is to cause death or great bodily harm. So that sort of broad definition encompassing different theories of malice is the reason that the differences in the Grand Rapids shooting case of Lioya and this case don't really matter as far as the legal standard go. Both involve the killing, both on the actions of the defendant, and neither are justified. In the case of Christopher Scher shooting Patrick Lioya, malice is easily inferred by the intent to kill that is obviously present when you knowingly discharge a round into the back of a person's head. In the case we're looking at here with Mr. Sterling, the element of malice is likely satisfied by the trooper's willful disregard of the fact that running a 4,000 plus pound SUV into a person and pinning them against the brick wall carries with it a likelihood that the natural tendency of that behavior is to cause death or great bodily harm. So in both cases, while factually different, they're legally the same. In both cases, the police killed a person with legal malice and the killing was unjustified, so they're likely guilty or at least chargeable with second-degree murder. In closing, I just want to suggest to you that federal law enforcement agencies are the most useless of all law enforcement agencies, and they are next to impossible to impose effective oversight on. All you have to do is search YouTube for 30 seconds to find video after video of futile attempts at congressional oversight as it relates to the executive branch of the federal government. It doesn't matter which side of politics you align with, both Democrat and Republican members of the House and of the Senate can be seen on video over and over again attempting to question and hold cabinet members in charge of the various executive branches of government to account for the conduct of their agencies. In one video, you might hear the Republicans griping about the border being wide open and the DOJ allowing the FBI, the ATF, and the IRS to target conservatives while ignoring the obvious crimes of the people on the other side of the aisle. And in other videos, you might see Democrats who spent an entire administration trying to bemoan the same border patrol they now defend for actually enforcing the law on the border. Neither can accomplish any meaningful change regardless of what you believe. Anything to do with the executive branch of our federal government has virtually unfettered power. I firmly believe that we need to abolish nearly all branches of federal law enforcement, at least as it relates to law enforcement on the local level. You can go to the city council, or you can go to the mayor, you can get the chief fired, you can get the sheriff held to account. You can get those folks that have real jobs that they actually care about losing to answer to the people who can get rid of them out of those jobs. You have no such influence on the federal level. And anytime we give local law enforcement agents the ability to collude with, accept license from, and act in concert with federal law enforcement agencies, this is what we get. And this is what we will always get. It's time for a radical change. Anyway, that's all for this one, guys. Thanks for choosing to spend your time with me. If you haven't already done it, please remember to like and subscribe and leave a comment on the video. It really helps the channel grow. I started making content on March 1st of 2024. It's May 19th, and we have amassed over 6,000 subscribers since that time, and I'm very grateful for that and for your support. Please watch some of the other videos on the channel and let me know what you think of them as well. Until I see you again, take care, always film your interactions with the police, and keep your evidence to yourself.